Welcome back to episode 8 of Sidewalk Skyline Podcast. Today we are starting a series that I call Gangland Preachers. In this and upcoming episodes, we're going to hear from some people that have first-hand experience when it comes to gangs and their effect on the community. Most of our discussions will focus on the Toronto area. Today's guest is Olu Jegede. He pastors Christian Center Church in Toronto. Hey, do you get those Amber Alerts on your smartphone? More than once, I've been awakened in the night by that disturbing ringtone to report that a minor has been abducted or has gone missing. I remember just in March of this year getting the alert about a 14-year-old boy that was missing from the Jane and Finch neighbourhood of Toronto. He had been abducted over a $4 million drug debt that his stepbrother had owed from last summer. Well, that young man was an example of someone that Christian Center Church and Pastor Olu Jegede know and care about. He was recovered by the police and returned home. These stories are all too real and personal for people like Pastor Olu. In 2007, Jordan Manners was killed by gun violence inside his high school. This was another young man that Olu had mentored over the years. Like Nehemiah of old, God calls some people into urban centers to build community and faith in places that have lost both. This session was a presentation that Olu gave at Our City, Toronto, 2019. Listen now as he shares about his work as a gangland preacher.
All right, so let's look at Nehemiah. We just read a couple of verses and then I'll share a story. So Nehemiah had a problem and God began to reveal the problem to him. And as we look at chapter 1, Nehemiah 1 verse 1, the words of Nehemiah son of Hakaliah in the month of Kislev in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. And they said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. And so here's the problem. The problem is the walls of Jerusalem had been broken down. Earlier, Ezra had led a cohort down to Jerusalem and began to rebuild the city under the decree of Cyrus, and things were okay. But after a while, the enemies came in and they discouraged the work of the Lord, and so now people have scattered. There's no more vision to continue the work of the Lord. So there's a problem in the city of Jerusalem, and this gets to the ears of Nehemiah, and he has a response. But really, we want to think about what is the problem that we are called to solve in our city? What is the problem that we are called to solve in our community? I believe that there is always a problem, particularly in the city. There is a problem wherever God calls his people, wherever he plants a church, wherever he calls you to go, there's a problem that you're called to solve. And in our community, in Jane and Finch, I believe it's a beautiful community. I'm a bit biased. That's why we have these shirts called I Love Jane and Finch. And it's a brand that's caught on. We have businesses, well, at least 2 businesses now that have ordered our branding, and they're in the community, right? They're like, we want to hear good things about the community. It's a beautiful community. So this is Jane and Finch, probably 100 years ago. Like much of Toronto, just a farming community. And then in the 60s, they decided that they were going to sell quite a bit of the land to developers because there was a huge immigration boom in the 60s. And so this is Jane and Finch now. So it's very multicultural, it's very dense, about 55,000 people live in just a couple square miles. And you see in fact, they call it the Jane and Finch corridor because you see like a whole corridor all along Jane Street for like a mile. You just see a corridor of apartments side by side all the way down. So, but if you want to go on missions, you don't have to travel too far. Just come to our community because there's lots of diversity, lots of ethnic minorities that are the norm. In fact, being Caucasian is a minority in our community, just because of just the diversity, and the world have come to where we are. Our people are beautiful. The criminal element that you hear of is probably less than 3% or even less than, I would say 0.05, maybe 0.05% in the community. A lot of people are new immigrants or immigrants, hardworking. They love their children, they love their families, they love Canada, and they love you and love each other. So they're just really good people. But the reality is that this experiment, if you want to call it that the city did a few decades ago in the 60s went wrong. It was a bad experiment. And what they did was they built too quickly, and they put too many people in just like this small square mile area, and you couldn't handle it. In fact, the records tell us that at some point in 1971, the population of Jane and Finch went from 1,300 to 33,000. 1,300 to 33,000 in just about 10 years. So you have thousands of people that have moved in, but you don't have infrastructure, you don't have the social resources, you don't have policing, you don't have the schools, you don't have the community resources to just help and manage the load. And so they created chaos. And so poverty, of course, was the result of just a lack of resources. About 22.5%, get this, of all residential dwellings were designated public housing. So 22% of all the residential houses in Jane and Finch are government Ontario housing, called Toronto Community Housing, at 22.5%. And so this high concentration of public housing units transformed the area into a high poverty neighborhood. And so this is what we're dealing with in our community. People, it seems, were left to fend for themselves. And so as a result, you have the high poverty. We have the highest percentage of poverty in Toronto. I'd say about 30% are under the poverty line. We have a lot of people are unemployed. And then just of course with education, a lot of our young people graduate high school, but maybe not post-secondary. You have issues like housing, where the housing conditions are deplorable. All these government housing, they don't keep up with them. If you're aware of the news, the Ontario Housing Corporation is in a bad financial state. They're trying to sell assets, so they're not maintaining these government houses very well. Some of our young people and families, they have mice and rats and snakes that come into their homes. And so it's just the housing, the education, the schooling, all these things are just dismal. So this is the dark side of our community. And so crime, of course, festers and feeds off this. You have our young people fall into gang and criminal activities. Our young girls are preyed upon. Some of them are goaded to go into prostitution at the age of 13 or 12 or even younger. And so this is our community. This is our problem that we face. And so we need to be aware of this. I remember when I first came into the community, just a youth pastor, I was super, super naive. I was sharing with Tim earlier today, and I was like, I just wanted to reach kids for the Lord. And now I'm the senior pastor. I like to say lead pastor. But then I was the youth pastor, and I just wanted to see kids saved. And so I ran basketball programs, drop-in stuff, and kids came, and we had lots of great things happening. And I noticed something though. Every week, the young people would give their hearts to the Lord. Every single week. But then after months, I realized it was always the same young people. And I said, isn't there any discipleship happening? Don't they know that once you give your heart, you're a Christian? And then it dawned on me that these kids had so much going on in their lives. As I began to kind of pull back the curtain, I realized that some of them had moms who had multiple partners coming in the homes, and there was drugs being sold, or just the deplorable conditions that they were living. And I realized that we had to do more than just preach the gospel. And I remember it was a funny story where we were playing basketball, and one of the kids goes up for a layup, and a knife drops from his, belt onto the ground, and I picked it up, and I'm like, what is this? And yeah, I love that quite a few of the kids would bring weapons back in those days into the program. And I went on the mic and I said, if you have a weapon, you need to check it in at the door. And then we will give it to you after you leave. So no one really did that. But my eyes began to open to the problems in the area, and that it wasn't just enough to speak the gospel. We had to find ways to reach them and to care for them. And so, you see, Nehemiah was aware of the problem. And I believe God has called the church. Thinking about it, what does it mean to be a community church? I believe God has called the church to answer what are the problems in our community. And that's what it means to be a community church, and begin to respond to that. Jesus was found in the midst of the darkness. Jesus was found with the sinners. He came for sinners. Even in Acts, we see the church was started, and quite early on, there was lots of poverty. The saints had to get offerings from the diaspora because there was such a famine in Jerusalem. And so the church historically has seemingly really being in the midst of the poor, being in the margins, being where the hurting are. And I think that's why it says in Acts 10:38 that God anointed Jesus with the Holy Spirit and power, and he went about doing good. Let's not forget that. We love the healing. We love the healing all those who were oppressed of the devil. But Jesus did a lot of good. He fed people. He cared for the lonely and the desolate. He did good. He was a do-gooder, right? We're called to do good in our community. So we're talking about knowing that the problem in our community, it's so key. And I didn't know the problem in my community for a while, actually. And so anyway, so then Nehemiah, he hears about the problem, and then he begins to experience something, which I think it's important before we go into solving the problem. Look at chapter 2, verse 1. It continues the story. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill?" "This can be nothing but sadness of heart." I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" See how he identifies completely with the city. He says, this is my city. This is my ancestors. This is where I come from. This is sort of my identity. And so he totally, completely identifies with the city. And I think we have to completely identify with where we're called. And we have to be so immersed to the point that we can go like EJ, when he says my Toronto, I'm like, really? But like he completely identifies with Toronto. So with your part of Toronto, or your part of wherever you're called, Stainer, we're just talking about that. Josh, right? Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. So when we identify the problem, we have to feel the pain. It engages our passions, and it allows it to become our priority. The church is called to heal. The church is called to heal pain. And honestly, I don't know if there is something called a community church. I don't like that term. I think that all churches should be community churches. Now, if for some reason churches have found themselves in the suburbs, or not suburbs per se, but in commercial industrial areas, I think they have to do a lot of work to reach their communities. And I think they can figure that out. But really, I think every church should be a community church, a church reaching its community. We can't afford to lose our way. We're called to engage our neighbors in the suburbs, in the city, wherever we are. We have to figure it out. And so that's why I don't like community church. I remember we went through this discussion when we had a change of pastors a few years ago, when the new pastor came and he didn't have a vision for the community. And he's like, our church isn't a community church. Our church is a church in a poor community, but it's not a community church. I was like, really? Our church is the church. We need to reach those in our community. And yes, we do have some who drive in, but we need to understand we're called to reach our neighbors wherever they are. Right? So I think there's been some of that debate through church, with church ecclesiology and so forth. But I think ultimately the question is, who is our community? Who is our community? Who are we called to reach? We not so much that we're a community church. I think is who is our community, right? Is it the sort of sporting people? Maybe you're in an athletic community, right? Is it maybe the university students? Is it the millennials? Is it the people that physically right beside you and your neighbor? Is it your friends at school? Is it who is your community, and who are you going to focus on? Who do you have that passion and that pain in your heart for? And then we see Nehemiah now. So we've seen how he's identified the problem and he's felt the pain. And then he says, I need to go closer. Look at verse 4. And the king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah, where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it. And so we have to go to our problems. This is about proximity, okay? It's about proximity. I need to be near the heart of the situation. And for Nehemiah, he had to go. He had to leave, I think it was in Persia or Susa, and he had to go and he had to be in Jerusalem. And for Karen, she had to be on Commercial Drive. And for us, we were called to move into our community, into Jane and Finch. And so let me tell you the story. So this is actually this is Elijah. So he's, 6 months-ish. Oh, probably.
Maybe a little bit more.
A little bit more. So I kind of set the story up. So basically we hadn't heard of anyone who was moving in. Okay, now it's a thing. Okay, we're talking about in 2005. Okay, there was no one that we heard of in the Payok then. All we heard was people going globally to missions, and that was great. And I guess maybe we were just more like an ostrich with our necks in the sand. We were not really talking to anyone, even in the denomination, about the things that was going on. And so we didn't know about moving in. Literally, it was God. We were just talking one day. We're like, man, we're always driving into we lived in Etobicoke, which isn't actually super far from Jane and Finch. It's still Toronto. But we just said we have to be where the action is. We have to be right where our church is. And so we were in our early 30s, and we were praying, and then we just got this impression we need to move into the community. We owned a bungalow, and selling would mean that we would not be able to actually purchase anything, because Jen had given up her job to stay with the children, so we couldn't qualify. If we give up the house, we couldn't qualify for another property. So there were some sacrifices with having to move into the community. And so we're thinking about it. We went to a conference in Camden. We met up with Shane Claiborne. He was at that conference, and he's like, yeah, you guys got to move in. You got to do it. And we read some John Perkins stuff and the CCDA, Christian Community Development Association in the States. And there's a whole ramped up movement. I mean, in the States, it's how you want to help a poor community. It's a no-brainer. They have a process. You need to move in. you need to redistribute, you need to relocate, you need to raise up indigenous, like it's a whole system, right? So they don't make any bones about it. Like, God, do you want us to move in? And so we finally took the leap of faith. We put up our home for sale in, I believe it was March of 2006. And we're like, God, if you're in this, then let it sell. And so we had about, it was probably February, because we moved in April. So we had about, 14 showings in a couple of days and multiple offers over asking. So we said, I guess God is in this, right? So we, sold the house and we moved into rental housing. And here we are, we moved into the community. Now, at this time, people thought we were crazy. Like our family, they're middle class, and they're just like, what are you guys doing? You're moving into like a ghetto. And in fact, we were so idealistic that we wanted to go into government housing, but they wouldn't let us apply because we made too much money. Even though we didn't make a lot of money, but we weren't poor enough to live in government housing, but we literally wanted to be the light and be neighbors as proximate. Anyway, so we just moved into private rental housing in the community. And so here we are, probably in April 2006, Elijah was born in that home. And so these are some of the early years being in the community with the children. We can go to the pictures there. We put all our kids, this is Abigail and Nicholas. She's probably 4 and he's 6 there, and we put them all in one room, and this 3. We went from a 2,000 square foot home to a 1,200 square foot rental, and so these are the kids just hanging. Is this actually Jesse back there? So
I remember this day.
You remember that day, right? So what began to happen was actually as we moved in, we found other young people started to move in. Jesse moved into the community. Now, we were young adult pastors at this time, and so we created a whole move-in movement. This is before moving.to. And so actually we can pause at this one. So we began to realize that other young people wanted to move in. So they're like, Pastor Olu's moving to the community. John, Jesse's husband, at that time they were married, he moved into the community. Some other people, the same townhouse block. We counted about a dozen people. Goya was here. Goya moved into the community. Counted about a dozen different people who maybe shared homes, and within about 4 or 5 homes collectively were living together and sharing resources. All of them were students. All of them were younger than we were. But through that, we began to create a kind of a sense of community that the Lord began to bring and kind of prepare us for what He was going to do. So this is we're talking about becoming one with the community, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. Really being proximate, but I think also just becoming one where you feel the pain, you feel the hurts, you know what's happening in that community because you're part of it. And so so we begin to have an open door policy, and we begin to have people over for meals. I don't know if we have some of that, but actually let's go back to this one. So this is interesting because what we realized was that because Jen's a teacher, we said, let's homeschool our children. Let's homeschool our children, even though we're now proximate in the community, we're feeling what they're feeling, we're neighbors, but we didn't want our kids to, go to the schools that the education is not up to par. It's not up to par. That's one of the issues in the inner city because most parents are not taxpayers. Their voices aren't as loud as in a tax-paying community. So the education system just is okay, but they tend to get overlooked in terms of school budgets. They all get the same budget, but parent councils in the richer areas are strong and they raise good money and they can bring extra stuff, extra equipment. In our communities, they don't do that. So the children fall by the wayside. And so Jen was homeschooling the kids for a couple of years, and but then we felt that we shouldn't hide the lights anymore, and so for a season we homeschooled, and I think homeschooling is fine. I know Jesse's they're homeschooling their children now, but before this, children were in public school. So for a season, it's fine as the Lord leads you, but for us, the season was over, and so we needed to immerse our children into the public school system because God wanted us to be a voice for some of those parents. And so Jen and I, we kind of rotated in being the chair of the school council. We would advocate for the parents and the schools just through natural leading, using some of our networks and influences, leading the barbecues, leading the committees, bringing in volunteers to help with school initiatives and that sort of thing. So it wasn't like we're ministering. And Karen, you get this. It was just like we're being a good neighbor. Our children are in the school, so we have a vested interest because we're one with this community. And so we didn't want their education to suffer, and so therefore we were going to be a voice for everybody else as well. A lot of times in the inner city, it's just who is going to sign up for the job. A lot of times no one wants to sign up for the job because they're doing 2-3 jobs and they're struggling to put food on the table. And so this is Nicholas and Abigail going to school. And Nicholas didn't really want to go to school, actually. He loved being home with Mom because Mom would do such a good job with school and field trips and such. But Abigail, super social, she was ready to go to school from day one. And so we continued to become one as we were close to the family, to in the community. And so we had an open door policy. I think we had some meals that we shared, some of the early pictures. And we have a picture here where we were sharing some meals with some. So we can. Yeah. So what we would do is we would just invite people over all the time, literally all the time. My children don't know. They don't know reality without the church members coming over, without the youth coming over. Naz, you've been over to my house several times this year, right? Naz is one of our young men. Let's go back to the meal for a second. Just want to touch on that. And so the meal became signature. Our home, our townhouse. So I would be sitting here, and this is the kind of sliding door to the backyard, and the backyard is at the by the walkway. So as people would walk by, I could see who was walking by. And I remember a story where I'm eating dinner and I see a young man that I had been waiting to connect with, and he had not come to church or what have you, but because I'm right there by the wayside, I run out. I'm like, "Hey, buddy, come for dinner." I grabbed him, and so that was sort of a feature of our ministry. I'm barbecuing by the sidewalk, and I'm giving people burgers as they go by. And literally, the church was across the road. So I mean, for me, it was heaven. Now we've moved back. We've recessed a bit further. Instead of being 100 feet from the church, we're 2 kilometers from the church. I mean, my heart broke when we moved away, but we're still super close. But this for me was like heaven, living in rental housing and being so close to the people that we love. And so we became one literally with that community, and ministry was so easy for us to do. And then in becoming one, so we moved closer, we put our kids in school, we realized that we had to be good neighbors in terms of having this open door policy. And then we started to take some risks. We made some friends in the community, and we would even go on vacation with them. And they had bad credit, so we said, here, use our credit card, because they had like a family of 5 children and we had a family of 4 children. So use our credit to rent a car, and And so we shared our credit, which is probably a bad idea. Found out that he was actually drinking and driving.
I didn't know that.
Oh, you didn't know that? Yeah. We went camping together, and at some point he was drinking. I was like, "You're drinking," but we took some risks, and we really poured into some families, in particular this family. And at some point, because Jen was staying home, she was able to help, I guess in a way, parent their children, because this family had some issues, and Jen would babysit 9 children, right?
Well, some of them were my own children.
Yeah, yours and theirs, and
Yeah.
and just really loving on them, and through that, I know that the lady and you decided to start a walking club, and because it was easier to get all the children to go, and they had fun as they walked. I think Jessie might have joined along, and some other moms in the community, and some seniors came along, and a company came to sponsor because they liked the idea of fitness and the idea of being urban and in the inner city. They had T-shirts that had the company's logo, and so a walking club was started, just organically, just naturally, by being a good neighbor and by opening up your door and all those sorts of things was going on. So we took some risks in becoming one with the community. And then when you're so present, when you're so local, you get to grieve. And nothing, I don't think there's anything greater than grieving with people when they're mourning. And so we had an opportunity to grieve with the community. This was in 2007 when Jordan Manners happened a few years back now, but Jordan Manners was the first young person in a high school to get killed by gun violence inside the school. So this happened in 2007, never happened in Canada before. And so this made news internationally. We had people calling from England saying, "We heard that this has happened." In the US it's different, but never in Canada had it happened. Well, this young man was a kid that I had mentored, and he was a kid that had taken on retreats, and it's a kid that had been in your Charlene's children's program. And so when he was 15, he got caught in the crosshairs of some stuff that was happening in the high school. We still don't know the details to this day because the case eventually was not solved. But he got killed, and so I remember those days of just literally walking over to the government housing where the mom lived, and just grieving with them. I mean, the smell of weed and the alcohol, because the family wasn't saved, but they needed love and they needed comfort, and I would just hug the mom and just hold her and weep and cry and feel their pain. I remember picking up one of the youngsters who was kind of an informant, and the police had me watching him, and I didn't know if he was innocent, but because all these kids are connected together, police never know who's guilty. So I remember picking him up, and me and John and Trevor, we took him out for dinner. So it was midnight. We just wanted, we know you're feeling down, your friend died, but then on the way back, the police officer, the cruiser, had been following us unknowingly from the young man's home to Montana, where we had dinner, till when we dropped the young man off at his aunt's house because he didn't want to go back to the neighborhood. And the police pulled us over, and they kind of made up a reason. They said I was drunk, and I said, no, I'm not drinking, like, I don't drink. And then eventually they said, okay, you can go. And it turned out that they had been following us because they were tailing that young man, and they just wanted to make sure that we were not sketchy people, and they couldn't really tell us that. So all these things, I guess, helped with our cred as we continue to grieve with the community. I became, at that point, somehow a community pastor, if you want to call it that, which I'm fine to call it that because the community saw me as their pastor. That's what I mean. Maybe if we mean that, then I think that's a good, well, we talk about community church, and how I don't like that term, but I like the term community pastor when non-Christians see you as their pastor. And so the school had been shut down. Jeffries High School had been shut down for, I think, for 3 days while they did a massive investigation with the Toronto District School Board and some lawyers and all that. They've been called in, and then an opening assembly that they had, they wanted a chaplain to come and to give a few words of healing and comfort. And so I was able to share in that forum that very important first day back to school. I remember walking those halls and counseling people. I remember talking with the principal and praying with her, and she was just distraught. I remember talking with teachers, and I remember God began to open certain doors, in fact, pivotal doors, because we became one with the community. We helped them to grieve. I'll share one door in a moment. But the amazing thing was, as we got closer, we began to realize that things look different when you're closer. Sometimes when you're further away, you think you know the problem, but you don't truly know the problem until, and you might bring your own solution, you might bring your own ideas, and we all have our own preconceived notions of how to be a pastor in a community like this. But when we got on the ground and we started to live and we started to immerse our children and we started to be one with the community, we realized from, I guess, a close-up bird's eye view, or well, not bird's eye view, but close-up view, we realized that things were different. This will happen with Nehemiah. I'm going to read the end of the story. When he got closer, look at Nehemiah 2:11. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding. By night I went up through the valley gate toward the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down. So he now goes to examine all the gates and of the wall and seen what was wrong. And then verse 17. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. So for me, this is really about having a team. Nehemiah couldn't do it himself. And, I had to learn that I couldn't do it myself. I kind of, in my bravado, I'm like, me and my wife and my children, we can do it ourselves. We're going to change this community. And after years of hurts and disappointments, realize that we can't do it. We need the team. And that's why I have the people here that I just owe so much to. You need the people to be part of it. One of the things that we did was, and these are some of our people, and it's funny because, it's not funny, but all the people that we've shown you, a lot of them are still part of our ministry today, and there's others as well. I think there's another photo, and some of those people are in the room today or downstairs or around, and this is John, Jesse's husband, and so most of all these people were part of the journey in some fashion, and now they're all either pastors or staff with the church or with Inner City Outreach, which is a nonprofit that the church created. I didn't create it, the church created it, but I relaunched it, and I made it thrive because it was dead in the water. And so I breathed life by the grace of God to it. So it's kind of right that I created it, but I didn't. So, and so we started to disciple. That was one of the main features. That is a bedrock to our ministry. I'm not a lead pastor at this point, guys. I'm still a youth pastor, youth young adult pastor. But I had a team of 24 amazing leaders who would do anything for me. We would meet every Tuesday night in my home. We would break bread. That table was key. Where I was saying my children have never known a time where we don't have people over in their homes, in our home. And every Tuesday night we would eat, we would pray, I would share, they would share, discipleship would happen, and then we would eat together, and they would hang out some more. And they were all young adults, so they had lots of time, right? So we did this all together for years, right, Jesse? for years and years and years. Like, it was almost like a cult. It was like every Tuesday night, you are in my home, and we're going to do this. And I was so passionate about this. And then they started to run all the ministries. They started to run all the clubs and all the homework clubs and everything that we did. All these guys, all these volunteers, they were not pastors. None of them was a pastor at that point. They were all doing it because they loved Jesus. And so discipleship, was huge in terms of garnering the people together, and a sense of communalism began to happen. And I didn't want to say communalism. That's the word. So, a sense of community, I so many anecdotes, and my time is winding down. And then as the doors opened, God blessed because the people were already there. So what happened was, when I was sharing at the assembly, at the Jordan Manors assembly at school, there was a school board trustee who was at the back of the room. He was a Jewish gentleman, and he heard me speak. And so he came to me after, and he said, I see that you're doing a lot for the youth and for the community. I would like to meet with you. I'm like, okay. And so he gave me my card, his card, vice versa. I didn't think anything of it. A couple weeks later, I get a knock on the door, and he shows up with a catered lunch at the church office. He and his associate, they brought in a catered lunch into my office. And so we sat down, and he's like, you know what? I want to see you take your programs from just this church. I want to see you go into all my schools. And he had 20-something schools at that point. I'm like, okay, how are we going to do this? This is great. And so by faith, I said yes. Didn't know how. Leaders ramped up, and but by faith, we're going to do it. And so we went from being at one site, which was our church site. We ran the program in the church at that time, to then going into, at some point, it was 4 different schools that we're in. We stopped at the 4th school, and it was the government paid for space, and they paid for snacks, and they paid for some of our employees, and so in 4 different schools we brought the program in, and we stopped because we wanted there to be quality, but we could have kept going and kept going and kept going. But all my leaders and my volunteers and my staff began to ramp up and began to just run these homework clubs. And the strategy was simple. You can't preach the gospel in the schools. They won't allow you to. But what you do is you go and do free homework tutoring, and then you can invite them to come to church programs as we intentionally organize them. And through that could work. Or just be a mentor, be a tutor, be a light, be a friend. And we've seen the different varieties of that. We've seen some of them come to know Christ. A lot of them haven't come to know Christ, but we've planted seeds, and we've been people of light and salt and light. And through the whole Jordan Manors story, people heard about us. With John's help as well, we had interns coming into the community. Moving into Jane and Finch, dozens of interns came, lived with us, and learned about the community, moved on, got some experience. So we became a mission hub for people to learn about what God is doing in the margins of Canada. The people have been incredible. Today we have people like Naz. Naz, you want to come up and join me? Naz, how old were you when you started coming to
church?
Yeah.
I started being around church when I was 6, I think.
And you were shorter than me back then, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And Naz is now how old?
18.
18. And we have people like Naz now who are around, who are now leading. This summer we had a camp with 50 kids, young people, and we had a staff of about 15 or 20 like Naz who ran the camp completely. And so we're talking about Indigenous leadership. I think it's one of the dream of any missionary, and that's one of the reasons why we moved into the community, because we felt we were missionaries and not just pastors, right? We felt like Any missionary's dream is that there will be indigenous leadership. And so as we see these young people now, they're running these camps, they're running these programs through Jen's leadership. And it's incredible because the people are really taking over what God is doing, and it's awesome. Let's give him a hand. Thank you so much. And check out his shirt. What's his shirt say? Making memories, building future, inner city outreach, Jane and Finch, Toronto. So I guess that's pretty much it. If I were to, are we going to have time for questions?
Yeah, we got five minutes.
Is that included in the 5 minutes?
Yep.
Okay. So, yeah. So just if I were to say what are some lessons that I've learned very quickly, is not everyone will come to know Christ. We're talking about being a community, being a pastor in your neighborhood. Pastor in your neighborhood. You need to just keep sowing seeds of love. Not everyone will come to know Christ. You just need to shake hands, love people, smile. My wife found out because she smiled at someone, they came to church because you were nice. She didn't share the gospel, she was just nice. They came to church and now they are a bona fide member in our church. Not everyone will come to know Christ, but always be sowing seeds. The world is always watching, and your reputation is really everything. Actually, we started a program. We got a $50,000 grant because the police officers came into our church and they saw us playing basketball with the teenagers, and they're like, "Hey, we know grants that we can apply for you to help you run community programming, and we will sign off on it." 6 months later, we got this $50,000 grant. You never know who's watching. Just be a light. Be people-minded, not problem-minded. As you focus on people, the problems will get solved. And also be clear on your mandate. This is so huge because people come, people go. In the inner city, in the margins, there's always transition. You're going to put everything in one person, and you know what? They're going to get a home in the suburbs. And they're like, "See ya, I don't want to be in the inner city. You love the inner city, I hate it." But, if that derails your entire plan, forget it. Like, just keep pouring into people, but let your mandate be clear. God will the chips will get rearranged. That's okay. But just stay focused, stay on track. You're called to rebuild that community for Jesus, right? And also similarly, don't be Western-minded in your approach to time sensitivity and strategy and structure. Again, things are always shifting on the ground. Think of yourself as a general at war, and you're always having to readjust to what the enemy's doing. So if you're always in boxes and schedules, which I am, and structures, and I've had to be hit so many times over the head, it's not always going to work out. So I have in my structure now a huge unknown box. But that's how I've been able to work it out. Today's going to go this way, except there's an unknown time frame between 2 and 5, and I don't know what's going to happen. And I can always shift that around, and that helps me just handle, because people are late and people leave and people, all that stuff, right? And that's pretty much it that I have to share with us.
Yeah. That was Olu Jegede from Christian Center Church. So how has the pandemic affected low-income households in the Jane and Finch corridor? Olu says that while schools are expecting kids to work online, a large percentage of the kids that they know don't have the requisite technology to do this. The schools are helping, but wheels are turning quite slowly. Some of the companies like Rogers are offering internet for just $10 a month during the pandemic. Also, some of the local schools have been able to give all the families of the students in their school grocery gift cards. Families, of course, have been hit economically with reduced income. In some of these households, the teenagers actually contribute to the household income. They're unable to do this now. Christian Center Church has also been delivering groceries and picking up medication for some of the seniors that they know. So let's remember to pray for Christian Center Church, for Olu and Jennifer and their family, and the team that works with them as they continue to show practical ways of loving their neighbors. You can link to Christian Center Church and Inner City Outreach in our show notes and find out more about them, perhaps even become a supporter. On our next episode, I'm excited to talk to Gangland Preacher Dr. Anthony Hutchinson, a leading consultant on Canadian gang culture, a psychologist, and Tyndall University professor. I had the opportunity to sit down with Tony and hear his own story of being a teenage gangbanger in Vancouver and his own journey to faith and wholeness. I caught up with him shortly after he was the keynote speaker at the Canadian Multi-Faith Federation's Community Forum on Guns, Gangs, and Violence, held on-site at Global Kingdom Ministries in Scarborough. You don't want to miss hearing Dr. Anthony Hutchinson. That episode drops on May 1st. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to keep hearing about God at work in Canadian urban centers. That's all the time for today's episode. So until next time, keep one ear to God and another ear to the ground in your city. I'm Kevin Rogers, and you've been listening to Sidewalk Skyline Podcast.